Stuart had bounced some ideas off me as far as what I could, talk about in Sunday school. And one of the things that he thought could be helpful to us is talking about a very prevalent belief system or worldview that is in our world today that we might not always see or really know what it is, but hopefully we can, pin some things down today and talk through it a little bit. I'm sure you guys have all heard of Marxism, right? Fun topic today. I hope it's not like, I was looking through my notes and I'm like, I don't think this is just going to be like a lecture. If y'all have any questions or want any discussion on anything, feel free to butt in or raise your hand, and we can get into some things. But I don't know. What do y'all think of when you hear the word Marxism? Oppressor and oppressed. Yeah, the two different kind of groups that they view all people, falling into one of those two categories: oppressor, oppressed. Okay. You might think of communism. You might think of, the Soviet Union or something like that, right? But we'll talk through kind of where this idea, this worldview came from, and what it looks like today. Because what it maybe originated at is not exactly what it looks like today in our, current Western culture. But it's still there. It's still there. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may be able to discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." So I'm going to use this term worldview quite a bit probably. And while we're going to hone in on Marxism, which is a worldview, Christianity is a worldview. So I want to just talk just for a minute about what a worldview is, and then we're going to kind of jump into Marxism, and that should be fun. Think of worldview as some glasses or a lens that you view everything around you with. A more technical definition would be a pattern of ideas, beliefs, convictions, and habits that help make sense of God, the world, and our relationship to both. So here's the thing about worldviews. You don't necessarily know that you have one. That's what's interesting about it. And that's what I think will be helpful about thinking about your own worldview and maybe learning about others. Because when you are introduced to a new idea, let's say a new law is being passed, or someone comes up to you and says something about morality, like, "Oh, I can't believe that this person did this," or "I can't believe that this person is doing this." Well, what do you do in those situations? You make a judgment, right? You either think that thing is right or you think that thing is wrong, and that is because of your worldview. It's your ideas, your beliefs, your assumptions, and we all have them. Now, what should our goal be? What should our goal for a worldview be? A biblical worldview. Yeah. Hopefully we are operating with a Christian worldview, one that is informed by the Bible. But I think, as we probably talked about quite a bit in this class, are all Christians living with a consistent biblical worldview? No. And that's true of me too. Sometimes when I hear something and I'm maybe like a little bit bothered by it, I have to, sometimes I realize like, oh, I actually shouldn't be bothered by this thing. It's wrong, and the Bible says it's wrong, and that can, come up in a variety of different ways. Do y'all remember Stuart's class on conscience? He spent quite a few weeks going through conscience. Honestly, that was probably one of the most helpful ways to think through, like, I think what your worldview is, how you react to certain things. Your conscience is helpful. It's a good tool that God has given you, but our conscience, just like our worldview, can be shaped by other ideas that are not biblical, right? Some of us might be operating with secular ideas or Marxist ideas or, New Age ideas that we've adopted from our culture, and we might not even realize it or have ever thought about it, all right? So I think the reason Stuart wanted me to get into Marxism a little bit is because there are small and large influences of it all over, even if it's not overtly called Marxism all the time. So we're gonna look into that today. So first off, raise your hand if you have heard of socialism. Okay, easy. Step one. Guess what? That is Marxist in origin, right? One way to look at socialism, which is a term that is thrown all around in our political systems today, not just in our country, all over the world. That has its roots in Marxism. And one way to look at socialism would be like a stepping stone towards communism. If you are a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist, you view socialism as like a way to get to your end goal, which would be communism. Now, does that mean that everybody in our world today that likes socialism is a communist or wants communism? No, not necessarily. They probably don't even know that what they're thinking has its roots in Marxism. And again, this is why it's so important to think through your worldview. Why do you think something is right? Why do you think something is wrong or helpful or unhelpful? So we're going to get back to the history of Marx quick, and then we're going to get to some really relevant applications today. So, something like socialism, last point here before I get into the, who Karl Marx was and that sort of thing. No system, no belief system or political system is neutral. I had a conversation with some friends of mine back in Washington State, and maybe it's because they're from Washington. No. And we were just, socialism came up, and they kind of were under the impression that socialism was just a neutral thing. Like, it's like, oh yeah, you can believe it, you don't have to believe it, you can be a Christian and believe it, it doesn't really matter, right? Socialism's just a political system that has no relevance to really Christianity, right? You can be a Christian and be a socialist or not. And I tried to push back a little bit and be like, well, what does God say about property rights or things like that? And does socialism have the same perspective as the Bible does on issues of property or things like that? And I think clearly the answer is no. So no, we're not just interacting in the world as like, oh, well, that idea sounds good, let's just go for it, right? We should be using our lens of Scripture to try to assess, what is good and what is wrong. All right, so Marxism. Karl Marx, after whom this movement, this worldview is named, he lived in the kind of early and mid 1800s. He published a famous work called the Communist Manifesto in 1848. All right, this is kind of where all of this begins. And now there were other movements that were similar going on around then, but this is where we can really trace maybe modern Marxism back to. So 1848, the Communist Manifesto. And historically, can you all think of anything going on in 1848 that would have been relevant to the development of Marx's theory of communism? 1848. Wait, what? That would come a little later. Well, that's a little later. That's they're influenced by Marxism. That'll be 1917. Sorry, what? Yes, that will relate. Industrial Revolution. Okay. Now, I'm trying to be gracious to the early Marxists here. If you were to walk into an industrial city in 1848, and maybe especially go to like the poorer areas of town or the industrial areas of town, would things have been good or bad for the most part? By our modern, judgments of cleanliness, air pollution, standards of living, working hours, things like that, things were really, really, really bad for many people, right? Now, in the long run, industrialization had a phenomenal positive effect on the poor and the rich and the middle class, right? It had a positive effect on everybody in the long term. But there were times in history where these changes in the way things were created and produced were terrible for some people. So there's a guy named Friedrich Engels who actually funded Karl Marx's work. And one day he visited, not just one day, he, I think, spent quite a bit of time in Liverpool, England, one of the first industrial cities. And he has a story of walking through this city, and actually it was Manchester, not Liverpool. Walking through the city, and as you walk down the street, your clothes are literally just getting covered in soot. And he's watching just the misery of people's lives as they're living in these tiny little houses in filth and crammed together. Disease is rampant. You can't even see the sun in these cities because of the terrible pollution. And he develops this idea that the poor are inherently oppressed, right? That this system is not working, that there's this kind of whole class of people that are just being abused and oppressed. They have no way out, and this is only terrible. And who's to blame, right? It's the upper class, the people that own the factories, the people that own the businesses, people that are running this production. And so he develops this whole philosophy, Karl Marx does, on this idea that you have two groups of people. Everybody in society can be split into two groups of people. One, and this is kind of what Johnny referenced earlier, is the upper class, the oppressors. He called them the bourgeoisie. And then you have the lower class, the working class, and they are the proletariat, right? So in his mind, his worldview that he developed and the people that latched onto Marxism developed is they would view everyone as falling into one of those two categories, right? You either were bourgeoisie and you kind of were inherently the oppressor or evil, or you were the proletariat, the working class, and you were inherently kind of morally good, and you were the ones that were going to kind of drive history going forward, all right? Can y'all see how that sort of thinking has maybe impacted our world today, that you are kind of, you fit into a particular category and you are going to be judged accordingly? Yeah, so I think we're starting to maybe see the importance of these roots. All right, so, but to be fair to them, things, as they looked around their world, some things were really bad and needed to be addressed. Now, was this the way? No. Is there a Christian way to address things like oppression and suffering and poverty and things like that? Absolutely. Yes, and we'll talk about some of those things too. And there were examples of people in those times that were addressing problems of poverty and working conditions in a Christian biblical way, which we might not have time to get into all that today, but there are some interesting ones I might mention. All right. Let's talk about, what does Marxism assume? What are some of the things that if you opened up the Communist Manifesto and read, which y'all could, it's actually not very long. You can find, I guess it depends on if you want to have Marxism.com or whatever on your browsing history. They'll very quickly give you a free PDF of the Communist Manifesto. So if you want to go read the Communist Manifesto, go ahead. It's again, not too hard of a read. It's pretty short. But there's a lot of things in there, okay? So let's talk about it. One, it's materialistic, meaning they believe that it's inherently atheistic, right? Marx firmly believed that there is no God, therefore, really there is no spiritual. There is nothing outside of the material world. That's what we mean by materialistic, all right? Yes, what you see is what you get. We are, matter in motion, however you want to kind of put that. Now, when Darwin came along, that actually gave a lot of fuel to Marxism, because it gave Marx, now that would be about 15 years later that Darwin came onto the scene after the publication of the Communist Manifesto, but it kind of gave fuel to this idea that, we have an explanation for all of this outside of God. Like, we can kind of totally remove God from the picture in our worldview, and now we have this totally materialistic way to explain how things came about, where did we come from, where are we going, all the big questions of life can now be answered by combining basically Marxism and evolutionary theory without God. So Marxism assumes the evolutionary progress of humanity, but it always involves the proletariat, the working class, the lower class, kind of rising up, overthrowing violently, right? This is not like a peaceful, like they just kind of, take power peacefully or something like that. His idea was they had to violently overthrow the upper class, those in control, seize power, and then, what happens when the poor take power, do you think? Well, then eventually they're the ones in control, right? So then what has to happen again? The people who end up being the lower class, have to overthrow. So that was actually part of his theory, and we don't need to get into all the technical terms, but basically, eventually, he believed that cyclical nature of history, where you'd have revolution, overthrow, that becomes the new normal, but then someone else has to overthrow that, and then you basically make an upwards progress through this revolutionary cycle until you finally reach communism, which is where everyone has finally become level. Nobody has ownership of property. And some other things that he'll advocate are the total abolition of religion, total abolition of the family. So no more family, no more religion, no more private property. Now, if you understand human nature from a Christian perspective, does that work? Does that happen? No, and you might be thinking, well, someone would have to force you to do that, right? That's not just going to happen, and then one day everybody's just going to get along, right? He did recognize that at some point there'd have to be like a dictatorship, but eventually he believed the government would no longer be necessary, so we would all just be living in everybody just gets along, nobody has private property. That's what the full realization of communism looks like in the Marxist mind. All right? And those things that they want to abolish are important, right? If you run into a Christian who claims to be a Marxist, which they are out there, you should ask them, like, all right, well, what do you think about the abolition of religion? What do you think about the abolition of the family? And, because those are all things that Marx and Marxists, they advocate. The abolition of inheritance, right? If you have somebody who's built up wealth, they've worked hard, they've accumulated property or wealth, and they want to hand it on to their children, something that we talk about a decent amount in the Christian worldview, that was an example of the bourgeoisie, right, this upper class group keeping control, right, and keeping their wealth from everyone else. Kind of lastly, to understand this traditional kind of Marxist mindset, throughout history, what has human population done since, let's say, 1848 when Marx published his Communist Manifesto? It's increased dramatically, right? I mean, it's multiplied many, many, many times over. And yet the living condition and poverty rates, for example, what have they done since the mid-1850s, do you think? They've gotten less, actually. Yeah. Over time, the percentage of people that live in desperate poverty has gotten lower and lower and lower and lower over time. Even in the past 50 years or so, globally. I'm going to be a little off on my statistics here because it's been a little while since I looked at them. But if you went back like 50 years, the percentage of people living in, what it was considered desperate poverty in the world was something in the 30s or 40s percentage-wise. Now, today, it's in like the low teens or 12% maybe. And that's with a drastic increase in the population still, right? We're continuing to drastically increase the population, and the percentage and the numbers of people living in desperate poverty is going down. Marx believed that we lived in a zero-sum game. Does anyone know what a zero-sum game is? Yes, if you have money, right, and that's what he was looking at. He was looking at economics. If you get money, it means that you've taken it from someone else, right? If you have money, it means someone else can't have that money, right? So that worked in his system of if there was this upper class with wealth, it automatically meant that there had to be a lower class without wealth, right? And if anybody became a millionaire, it meant that it was, to the detriment and loss of other people. That makes sense? So that's a zero-sum game. There's only a certain amount of material in the world, and if somebody has some of it, then someone else can't have it. All right? But what we've seen in economics and the advancement of technology and things like that, that hasn't been the reality, right? Wealth has been produced in different ways. Technological advancements have made certain, health conditions and, providing food for enough people has less of an issue, right? One cool example is apparently, I don't keep up on these things, like 10 years ago, 20 years ago maybe, people were really scared that we were going to run out of copper, right? And we use copper in all sorts of things. You think of like wiring and things like that. Well then, fiber optic cables were invented. And does anyone know what's used in fiber optic cables instead of copper? What? Glass. Right? And where do you get glass? The sand, right? And I don't think we're going to run out of sand, anytime soon. So there, not to say that we should always just like say, hey, we're just going to figure it out. We should never worry about, environmental or, wealth problems. But we obviously have seen God provide for his people and see this incredible progress throughout humanity that has not fit the zero-sum game that Marx was operating under the assumption of. All right? So I think just that right there kind of makes Marxist theory kind of just bunk, right? It just hasn't worked that way. It doesn't work that way, along with all the very non-biblical things that we see. All right, now, so that's traditional Marxism. There are dyed-in-the-wool Marxists out there who want to revolt and overthrow, violently the current system. There are not very many of them, though, I don't think, in our culture today, right? There's not too many of those out there. What we see more today is what we might call neo-Marxism, right? New Marxism. They've taken Marxist theory and they've adjusted it, expanded it to kind of fit our world today. All right, so I want to briefly talk about that. A couple years ago, I was in a coffee shop in Lafayette, and baristas are usually very friendly, and they're talking with some of the customers, and I just overhear this sweet barista. She was telling this guy, I think I'm kind of a communist, and I just overheard it. I didn't hear where the conversation really went from there, but I thought it was so fascinating. It was just kind of like, I just decided to be a communist today, and I doubt she understood exactly what she was saying, right? And she probably wasn't saying, I believe everything Marx said, and I think that I'm going to go grab my rifle or my pitchfork and go, overthrow the current system tomorrow. She probably wasn't saying that, but Marxism, it's kind of its model has affected how people think today. Right off the bat, people started saying like, well, do we really want to like revolt all the time? There were people that loved Marxism, but they were like, I don't know about this whole violent thing. So right away that you had new branches of communism that came out that were basically, there were a couple different, one was called revisionism, one was called Euro-communism, and basically it was like, we want communism, but we're going to do it peacefully. So how do you do it peacefully? If you're not going to grab your pitchfork and kill some rich people and take over, how could you accomplish communism peacefully? Wait, what? Oh, yeah, exactly, yeah. Get communists elected, right. Basically, you used to use the political, systems in place, and at that point, take over the education system, get people elected into office, pass laws that are favorable to, high taxation and pushing towards communism. It was basically they started playing the long game, and we've, I think, definitely seen the effects of that today. All right, so again, you're not going to see too many dyed-in-the-wool Marxists today, but you are going to see people that think more along those lines. Some examples. I wanted to use some very practical examples of maybe some ways, and you guys could, if I'm wrong, just tell me I could be. When I see things like this, I think, all right, this is probably has Marxism at its roots in ways that it's affecting us. Tax the rich, right? The assumption in our society today is kind of that the people who have a large amount of what they have needs to be taken, right? That's just kind of and that's assumption that probably a lot of Christians walk around, assuming. But we need to, again, look back at our Bibles to see, like, all right, where do we get ideas like this? Are we voting for certain people or certain laws because we want what other people have? If so, what would we call that as Christians, maybe? Covetousness, theft, maybe, right? Do y'all remember the AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez dress at the Met Gala, right? It's a white dress with the big red letters on the back, tax the rich. I think she was saying more than just like, she was putting more forward probably than just her tax policy. In blood red letters, tax the rich, I think definitely probably has its roots in some Marxist ideas, right? Taxation on inheritance exists today in our nation. Not in all states. I was looking this up. But in certain states, in certain places, you can't just give your stuff to your kids. Isn't that crazy? You can't give your stuff to your kids. The government is going to come in and grab a good portion of that. in certain places whenever you die and want to pass on what you have, your property, your wealth, to your children. Now, again, the people that passed that law, I don't know if they were communists, but it does seem to maybe have its roots in some communist assumptions that, we need to, if we let certain people have certain stuff, then it means that other people aren't going to have enough, right? Or it means that they inherently, aren't going to have enough. Maybe still assuming some zero-sum game things there. Very recently, when a couple of billionaires went down in a submarine and died, what was a common reaction in the world, if y'all were tracking that at all? They were rich, so who cares? Yep, and that would have been more the tame reaction. Even more often maybe was, well, they were rich, they got what they deserved. I saw that all over the place in, comments on Facebook and whatever else. They were rich, they got what they deserved, right? So their wealth inherently made them evil. Well, where would we get an idea like that? Marxism, right? This goes back a little bit to the origins. In Marxism, there's this idea called the proletariat morality, and it's basically the idea that because the working class has been through suffering, and this, again, he's coming from 1848, middle of the Industrial Revolution, he believed that their suffering was a crucible of morality, that because they had been through stuff, they inherently had a better grasp on morality and were inherently moral, compared to someone who maybe had lived with more ease, would be inherently more evil. Now, can we draw that from, do we get an idea like that from the biblical worldview? I would say no. I would say no. Now, if you make wealth your God, yeah, absolutely. Like the Bible warns about that. The Bible warns about, because you're impoverished, turning to theft too. It doesn't hold you less accountable because of your socioeconomic status, right? That's an important distinction to make. I know Stuart's used this example before, but I gave it to him. So here you go. There was a Netflix documentary about Jeffrey Epstein, and all the horrible things that were going on with human trafficking, pedophilia. The documentary about one of the guys who was basically making this happen behind the scenes, the title of the documentary about basically human trafficking and pedophilia was, do you remember it? Filthy Rich, right? So what does that title have to do with the sexual crimes that were being committed? Nothing, right? But the assumption was that it was because of wealth, right? Because they were rich that they were committing these terrible acts. Again, I could be wrong. I see something like that, and I see kind of roots of Marxism in there. All right, so this is why understanding your worldview is important. One last kind of term maybe for how neo-Marxism is happening maybe in our society today. Has anyone heard the term intersectionality? Intersectionality. I know Johnny looks tired of it. He's heard it so much, maybe. No. This is kind of maybe what neo-Marxists have, the new Marxism has developed. So rather than today having just two groups of people, you've got the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the upper class and the working class. Now, just by being born in a particular place or to a particular family, you belong to an intersectional group. So that could be your, ethnic group. That could be your wealth status. That could be, whether you have a disability or not. That could be lots of different things. But basically, you can be categorized on a spectrum of oppressor or oppressed based on what groups you belong to. Okay? So it's gotten a little more complicated than Marx's original idea of, proletariat bourgeoisie. It's now, a bunch of different things. Can you all think of what the worst or the most oppressed or privileged group might be in our society today according to intersectionality? Wait, what? So yeah, they would be on the most the most oppressed, therefore the most moral and good, right, kind of, level. Especially if you're, maybe like an ethnic minority and LGBTQ, and maybe you have another disability and you're poor, then you're like 4 levels oppressed, right? That's kind of how they would view that. Now, if you are a white, male, wealthy, cisgendered, and then the worst would be Christian, then you would be like 5 levels of oppressor, right, in the mindset of intersectionality, all right? Does that kind of make sense? Hopefully that was just like a quick crash course to what is probably more complicated than that, but hopefully that breaks it down for you a little bit. All right, so that's how they've reworked this class divide. They've just created lots of classes, and you can fit to, they intersect in different ways. Okay, Christian response. I'm going to wrap up here with this. Proverbs 11:1 says, "A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight." So that's talking about economic exchanges, but it's also talking about in the way that you carry out law and things like that. If you treat certain people, poorly because of who they are, or you treat other people, well, basically if you're using unequal measures in the way that you are interacting with others, God calls that an abomination. So while it's easy in our world today, just by watching TV or watching movies or reading the news, you could easily buy in to ideas about certain people because they just belong to a certain group, having certain characteristics or being evil or whatever it might be. As Christians, we need to fight against that. I think, again, I've seen this in my own life in different ways, where if I just kind of go through, I hope that in the last few years I've learned a lot, but maybe I could look at myself 5 or 10 years ago, having bought into some of these ideas and not even known it. Like I would just see something about, this politician or this rich person over here or this whatever, and I would make judgments, not based on equal measures, right, or equal weights, as the Bible encourages us to do, but based on this understanding that the culture had given me, right? And that's why thinking about what our worldview is and trying to apply the Bible to everything we do is so important. If the goal of communism is to make kind of everything flat in the end, is that Christian? Flat meaning everybody has all the same stuff. You don't really even, I don't know. There's lots of different problems with it, I guess, but I see some shaking heads. God created hierarchy, right? And now, are there times in the Bible where this hierarchy can be abused or go into sin? Absolutely. We see kings. We see warning after warning in books like Isaiah of the wealthy oppressing the poor, right? But that doesn't give us categories of the wealthy being inherently evil. We also see wealthy people throughout the Bible doing good, hosting the church, and people being given great wealth because of their righteousness. So those warnings are there, but we don't see those. But we have categories. We have proper categories for them. So God has created hierarchy. We talked about thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not steal. There are laws in the Bible that protect property, that command us not to steal. And what are some ways that Christians could respond? We'll wrap up with this. What are some ways that when we do see oppression, when we do see poverty, when we do see inequality that is not inherently bad, but the result maybe of evil, what are some ways that Christians can respond biblically? Call it what it is. Yes, call sin sin when you see it, but don't call something sin when it's not sin. I think, yeah, absolutely. And that's where we need to know, what sin is and what it's not, and yeah. Right. Yep. Yeah.
do it in a way that can honor God and that kind of stuff. So we have to constantly be
No, absolutely.
reflecting God's truth.
Yep. Yep. For sure. Yeah, that'd be a fun assignment. If you look through like people's Facebook feeds and just like picked out random quotes they've reposted or things like that, like what worldview is that actually coming from? Yeah. How about generosity, right? When we see poverty, suffering in our world, our reaction should not be, we just need to throw everything away, revolt, start over, right? We see societies that have embraced Christ progress and great things happen over time, and part of that is through the innovation and the generosity of Christians. You know, I think that could be a good thing to remember as well. The hospitality, I think, would fit into that, right? That's something we've been talking about. Anything else before we wrap? All right, awesome. Well, let's pray, and then we'll be done for today. Dear Lord, thank you so much for your word, and I pray that we would just dig deep and understand how it affects our lives and not be led astray by cultural ideas, ideas that we might not even know what they are or where they come from. I pray that we would not just be using our own rationality alone, but that we would be using it in submission to your word, and that we would be not just knowing the truth, but we would also have a greater love for one another because of your word and what you have done. I pray this in Jesus' name.